Hello everyone, and welcome to our channel. Before the story begins, make sure you've subscribed. It's completely free, and it ensures you'll never miss a jaw-dropping twist or thrilling adventure. Your support means everything to us. It fuels our passion and helps this storytelling community grow stronger every single day. Wishing you a day full of peace, joy, and inspiration. Disclaimer: this is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental. This story is created solely for entertainment and does not promote or glorify violence in any form. Now sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. He thought he was old until he met her. Talyan Kor, stellar cartographer and statistical outlier among his people, had always believed 42 cycles made him a marvel of longevity. Then he met a Solari who had seen more seasons than he had star systems. Talyan Naharix listened with half attention as Director Nixwell guided him through the curving corridors of stellar twilight retirement community. His single central eye wandered, taking in the other residents through his thick corrective lens. Most moved with a deliberate pace of advanced age, their various anatomies showing the unmistakable signs of time's passage. As you can see, our facilities offer exceptional views, Director Nixwell said, gesturing with one of her 4 tentacle-like appendages toward the transparent dome overhead. Talyan looked up, momentarily forgetting his internal catalog of ailments. Beyond the protective barrier, a majestic gas giant dominated the vista, its swirling storms of amber and crimson creating patterns across a canvas of deep azure. We orbit Epsilon Eridanabe at precisely the optimal distance, the director continued, close enough for residents to enjoy the atmospheric display, yet far enough to avoid all possibility of unlucky collision with natural debris. Quite impressive, Talyan acknowledged, adjusting his posture. His teal skin had begun to fade to a paler hue in recent years, a common sign of aging among the Pythians. At 42 cycles old, he had already surpassed the typical lifespan of his species by a comfortable margin. The daily schedule accommodates the biological rhythms of all our residents, Director Nixwell continued, walking purposefully through the corridor. Medical facilities occupy the lower level, communal areas this level, and private corridors above. Your room has been configured to Pythian atmospheric preferences. Talyan followed, his 6 spindly arms not quite as coordinated as they once were. He felt a twinge in his 3rd right elbow, another entry in his growing catalog of age-related discomforts. Here we are, the community lounge. Many residents gather here during the afternoon rest period. The lounge opened before them, a spacious area with various seating arrangements designed for different physiologies. Near the center, 3 elder aliens sat in a loose circle, engaged in quiet conversation. "Allow me to introduce some of our residents," Director Nixwell said, guiding Talyan toward the group. "Madam Glirna, Trillium, Dr. Krell, this is our newest resident, Talyan Kor." Madam Glirna turned, her translucent gelatinous skin catching the light. Her eyes blinked asynchronously as she nodded in greeting. "Welcome to stellar twilight," she said, her voice melodious and warm. Trillium rose slightly, his once vibrant yellow exoskeleton now faded to a soft amber. His iridescent wings, permanently folded against his back, twitched in a gesture of welcome. "Delighted to meet you," he said, compound eyes lightly clouded. Dr. Krell extended a 3-fingered hand. "I'm the physician here, though semi-retired," he said, the modest ridge along his skull rising slightly in greeting. "Should you need anything, my office is always open." "Thank you," Talyan said, settling into an open seat designed for his species' proportions. He was acutely aware that at 3 feet tall, he was the smallest among them. I'm sure I'll adjust quickly. I've had plenty of practice adapting to new circumstances. Director Nixwell excused herself with a professional nod. I'll leave you to get acquainted. Dinner chime sounds at 1800. As she departed, Madame Glierna poured a fragrant tea into specialized cups, designed for each species' unique biology. How was your journey here, Talien? Not too taxing, I hope. Manageable, Talien replied, accepting the cup with his right upper hand. Though my species doesn't tolerate extended travel well, especially in our senior years, the medical stasis made the trip bearable. And what was your occupation before retirement? Dr. Krell asked, adding a small tablet to his own tea. I was a stellar cartographer, Talien said, his head fronds perking up slightly with pride. I reached senior classification in the Galactic Mapping Consortium, a rare achievement for a Pythian. Our accelerated biology doesn't typically allow for extended career advancement. Fascinating, Trillium commented. I was an interstellar navigator myself. Perhaps I once traveled some of the same routes. Possibly, Talien replied, then couldn't help adding, I catalogued the stellar phenomena of 17 systems over my career. The Guild typically expects 6 to 8 from most cartographers and most Pythians, usually only complete 3 or 4 before retirement. Dr. Krell nodded with genuine interest. The Varian's lifespan among sentient species creates such interesting career trajectories. Did you map any of the, Cygnus Quadrant during your time? I worked almost exclusively in the Cygnus and Perseus quadrants, Talien answered, pleased at the recognition. My contemporaries from the Academy marveled when I returned for my 30th cycle reunion. I was the only one of 3 Pythians from our graduating cohort, still practicing. He noted a subtle exchange of glances between the other residents but continued, his head fronds still rising. My 5th-generation descendants recently established their own clutch. Their newly hatched young can scarcely comprehend having a great-great-grandparent still living to tell stories. Madame Glierna nodded appreciatively. Family connections across generations are indeed a blessing, regardless of species. If I may ask, what constitutes old age for your kind? Talien inquired, genuinely curious. Voloksians typically live about 70 cycles, she replied. I'm 67 now. Talien's eyes widened slightly. This was considerably longer than he had anticipated. He turned to Trillium, who seemed to anticipate the question. Vesperians average 60 cycles. I'm 54 currently. Talien then turned to Dr. Krell, who added, Brassati typically reach 90 cycles. I'm 81 and semi-retired. As I mentioned, Talien fought to maintain his composure. He had entered the facility, expecting to be among the most senior residents, not the most junior. Still within his own species, his longevity remained exceptional. Well, 42 cycles for a Pythian represents quite an extended lifespan. Our metabolism operates at nearly triple the standard rates of most council species. A soft chime sounded throughout the lounge, indicating dinner preparation. Shall we, make our way to the dining hall? Dr. Krell suggested, standing with careful deliberation. As they gathered themselves to relocate, Talien caught a whispered exchange between Trillium and Madame Glierna. Should we tell him about Mrs. Thorne? Trillium murmured, his wing cases making a barely audible sound. Madame Glierna gave a subtle negative gesture. Not yet. Let him settle in first. Talien pretended not to hear, but the mysterious name lingered in his mind as they made their way toward dinner. Another resident, presumably. Perhaps someone even older than Dr. Krell. The thought both intrigued and unsettled him as he followed his new acquaintances through the gently curving hallway. The massive gas giant, casting colorful shadows through the dome above. The morning light of distant Epsilon Eridani filtered through the dome of stellar twilight, casting the community lounge in a gentle amber glow. 1 week into his residence, Talyan had established a comfortable routine. Each morning after his nutritional supplements, he would join the regular gathering in the lounge, where various residents engaged in conversation or quiet recreational activities. Today, Talyan settled at a small table where Trillium had set up a holographic game board. The three-dimensional planetary conquest simulation hovered between them, tiny fleets and celestial bodies rotating slowly in strategic formation. "Your move, my friend," Trillium said, his compound eye studying the board with a practiced assessment of a former navigator. Talyan extended his second right arm, manipulating a fleet of ships into position near a contested moon. "There," he said with satisfaction. "That technique that served me well in my cartography days." Dr. Krell watched from a comfortable seat nearby, a data tablet resting on his lap. "Interesting strategy," he commented, the ridge along his skull rising slightly in what Talyan had come to recognize as an expression of interest. Madame Glerna approached with a tray of morning refreshments, her translucent form moving with deliberate grace. "You seem to be adapting well to our little community, Talyan," she observed, distributing specialized drinks to each resident. "I found the environment quite suitable," Talyan replied, accepting a nutrient-rich solution specifically formulated for Pythian biology. "Though I must admit, the schedule seems rather leisurely compared to what I'm accustomed to." Trillium made his counter move, sending a defensive array to intercept Talyan's fleet. "We find that a relaxed pace suits our collective needs. When one has accumulated as many cycles as most residents here, rushing seems rather pointless." Talyan studied the board, his singular eye narrowing in concentration. His maneuver had been elegantly countered, forcing him to reconsider his strategy. After careful deliberation, he repositioned his forces, only to watch Trillium immediately exploit a weakness he hadn't foreseen. "Tactical error, I'm afraid," Trillium announced, his wing cases vibrating in a subtle gesture of triumph. "Your moons are now under my control." Talyan's head fronds drooped slightly in disappointment. He smoothened them with his upper left hand, a nervous habit that had intensified with age. "Oh, my strategic calculations aren't what they once were," he said with a sigh. At 42 cycles, one's cognitive reflexes inevitably decline. "My sixth clutch mate showed similar deterioration when he reached his 30th cycle, though he didn't survive long beyond that milestone." Dr. Krell and Madame Glierna exchanged a silent glance that Talyan couldn't quite interpret. This had happened several times over the past week, whenever he mentioned his advanced age. A strange reaction he couldn't decipher. "Speaking of milestones," Madame Glierna said, changing the subject, "the community will be celebrating its founding anniversary next month. Director Nixwell mentioned organizing a special gathering." "Indeed," Dr. Krell added, 38 years, Federation standard, since Stellar Twilight first opened its docking ports to retirees, not particularly long by cosmic standards, but significant nonetheless." Talyan perked up, his head fronts rising. 38 years. That's the equivalent of my entire lifespan. I was born the very same year this facility opened. He chuckled, a whistling sound through his breathing slits. "While you were establishing this community, my progenitors were weaving my incubation nest. Quite a coincidence." Trillium agreed, resetting the game board for another round, though perspective on time varies dramatically across species. Throughout the morning, their conversation drifted through various topics: recent developments, in galactic politics. Reminiscences of career achievements, comparison of homeworlds, yet every time the dialogue meandered toward matters of longevity or age, Tullian found ways to emphasize his extraordinary status among Fithians. My sixth spawning cycle was considered unprecedented, he mentioned while describing his family structure. Most Fithians are fortunate to witness 4 generations of descendants. Later, when discussing technological advancements, I've witnessed 18 major revisions of navigational algorithms during my career. Even for longer-lived species, that would be quite the number. Chaotic times I lived in. By midday, Tullian had lost 3 consecutive games to Trillium. As they concluded their final match, he sighed dramatically. My reflexes simply cannot keep pace any longer. Age claims its due. From all of us, eventually. Trillium deactivated the holographic board with a gentle tap. Perhaps we should transition to literary discussion this afternoon. The community library has received several new volumes from the Arcturian Poetry Symposium. Before Tullian could respond, a soft chime indicated the communal meal period. The residents began moving toward the dining hall, a spacious chamber with panoramic views of the gas giant below. Tullian walked alongside Dr. Krell, his shorter legs working harder to maintain the pace with the Brasati physician. "Oh, I must say," Tullian commented as they entered the dining area, "the abundance of elderly specimen from various species offers fascinating comparative study. In Fithian academic circles, there are extensive debates about whether our accelerated life cycle is actually advantageous." Dr. Krell selected a seat designed for his physiology. "In what conclusion have you drawn from these debates?" Tullian settled into his own chair, adjusting his posture to accommodate the slight ache in his lower spine. "While our rapid development allows for accelerated generational adaptation, I've come to believe there's wisdom in protracted existence. My extensive career accomplishments support this theory. Had I possessed the typical Fithian lifespan, I would have cataloged perhaps 4 star systems rather than 17. At a nearby table, several residents representing 6 different species engaged in lively conversation. Tullian noticed a conspicuously empty seat, customized for a physiological structure he couldn't immediately identify. "Is someone absent today?" he inquired, gesturing toward the vacant space. Mrs. Thorne often takes her lunch in the observatory at this hour. She enjoys watching the storm patterns on the planet below." "Mrs. Thorne?" Tullian repeated, recalling the whispered name from his first day. "I don't believe we've been introduced." A moment of silence fell over the table. Dr. Krell set down his utensil with deliberate care. "Mrs. Thorne is something of an institution here at Archive Haven." Trillium nodded, his faded exoskeleton catching the light. "She was the first resident when the facility opened, before any of us arrived." Tullian's central eye blinked rapidly. "The first resident? But that would make her ancient. If I recall correctly, 103 Federation Standard years, to be precise." Madame Glirna finished, her voice taking on a tone of quiet reverence. Tullian nearly choked on his nutrient solution. "Oh, 100 and... that's impossible. She may be using extensive life extension technology." Dr. Krell shook his head. "No artificial extensions. Mrs. Thorne is quite proud of her natural longevity." Tullian's head fronts flattened in disbelief. "But what species live so long naturally? Surely not." His voice trailed off as the implications became clear. "Mrs. Thorne is Solari," Trillium confirmed, his wing cases moving slightly in what might have been amusement. Tullian couldn't contain his skepticism. "A Solari, But Solaris are notoriously fragile creatures. Their homeworld's high gravity and dangerous fauna require them to develop intelligence precisely because their physical forms are so vulnerable. He smoothened his head fronts nervously. Every xenobiology text describes them as soft-bodied, lacking natural armor, with minimal regenerative capabilities. Madame Glirna's eyes blinked asynchronously, yet they endure. Mrs. Thorne has resided in stellar twilight since its founding 38 years ago. According to facility records, she was 65 years old when she arrived. 65, Talion repeated, mental calculations racing. That would have been considered elderly, even for a Solari, according to my understanding. By Solari standards, she was approaching senior status. Dr. Krell confirmed. But their definition of elderly differs substantially from most galactic species. Solaris commonly live into their 80s or 90s, with centenarians becoming increasingly common. Talien's disbelief transformed into suspicion. "You're testing me," he accused, his voice rising to a higher pitch. "This is a elaborate initiation ritual for new residents, isn't it? Create an impossible story about an ancient Solari to humble the newcomer." The other residents exchanged glances again, but this time Talion detected no secrecy in their expressions, only patient understanding. "I assure you, Mrs. Thorne is quite real," Dr. Krell said gently. "If you like, we could introduce you this afternoon." "Yes, please do," Talion responded, his tone making it clear he expected to expose their deception. "I would very much like to meet this alleged centenarian." Trillium leaned forward, his compound eyes fixed on Talion. "Why does this revelation disturb you so deeply, friend? Is it merely scientific curiosity or something more personal?" The question caught Talion off guard. He smoothed his head fronts again, a gesture that now seemed painfully obvious even to himself. "I simply find it difficult to reconcile with an established knowledge," he replied defensively. "Fythians may have accelerated lifespans, but we understand our place in the biological spectrum. Solaris are soft, vulnerable creatures from a high-gravity death world. They shouldn't outlive multiple generations of my species." Madame Glirna placed her gelatinous head near Talien's in a gesture of gentle understanding. "Perhaps it would help to hear the story directly from Mrs. Thorne. She has outlived many residents here." Talion's central eye narrowed. "You speak as though this Solari has achieved some mythical status. Next you'll tell me she remembers the founding of the Galactic Council." "Hey, nothing so dramatic," Dr. Krell assured him. "But she does remember when stellar twilight was merely an architectural concept. She attended the inauguration ceremony alongside Director Nixley's father." "Impossible," Talion muttered, but his conviction was weakening. His companion seemed entirely sincere, with no hint of the mischief one would expect from perpetrators of a practical joke. The conversation continued through the meal, with Talion pressing for details about this mysterious Solari resident. Each answer only deepened his confusion and disbelief. How could a species so physically unimpressive endure for a century or more? It contradicted everything he thought he understood about galactic biology. As they finished their meal, Talion became aware of a subtle change in the dining hall's atmosphere. Conversations quieted, and several residents turned their attention toward the entrance. The soft whirring sound of mechanical assistance caught Talion's ear slits, and he turned to identify its source. An anti-gravity wheelchair gilded into the room, carrying a small figure wrapped in a handcrafted shawl, depicting astronomical patterns. Wispy white hair framed a face marked by unmistakable signs of advanced age. Yet the bright blue eyes that surveyed the room remained strikingly alert. "Ah," Dr. Krell said quietly. "It seems you'll have your introduction sooner than expected. Mrs. Thorne has decided to join us, after all." Talion stared in disbelieving silence as the elderly Solari navigated her wheelchair toward an adjacent table, greeting various residents by name with a warm smile and a gentle voice. The impossible truth he had denied now sat merely meters away, defying every assumption he had made about his place in the cosmic order of things. That's really a Solari," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "And she's truly over a century old. 103 years, Madame Glierna confirmed softly, and you'll find her mind remains as sharp as those remarkable blue eyes." Talion watched as the Solari woman deftly manipulated the controls of her wheelchair with slightly trembling hands, adorned with what appears to be a simple metal band on one finger. His own 6 hands suddenly felt inadequate despite their greater number, and his 42 cycles of existence, once a source of such pride, seemed almost trivial in comparison. "Would you like to meet her now?" Trillium asked, noting Talion's fixated gaze. Before Talion could formulate a response, the elderly Solari looked up, her bright blue eyes meeting his single central eye across the room. She smiled, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed both amusement and welcome, and inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement of his attention. Talion began, then fell silent, smoothing his wilting head fronds in a futile attempt to compose himself. The gravity of realization weighed on him as heavily as any planetary pole he had ever charted. For the first time since arriving at stellar twilight, Talion Core found himself utterly matchless. The dining hall fell into a gentle hush as Mrs. Ilaria Thorne navigated her anti-gravity wheelchair toward Talion's table. Her approach was unhurried, deliberate in the way that only those who have witnessed decades pass can achieve. A pace that suggested time itself was a familiar companion rather than an adversary. Talion remained frozen in his seat, his single eye fixed on the Solari woman. Up close, she appeared simultaneously more fragile and more substantial than he had anticipated. Her skin bore the unmistakable marks of a century of living, fine lines radiating from the corners of her eyes, deeper creases framing her mouth, translucent patches spotted with accumulated pigment. Yet her posture, even seated, conveyed a quiet dignity that transcended physical vulnerability. Her hands, slightly trembling with age, adjusted a beautiful crafted shawl that draped her shoulders. Talion noted with fascination that the garment depicted the inner planets of the Sol system in intricate needlework, each celestial body rendered with remarkable astronomical accuracy. "You must be our newest resident," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than Talion had expected. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Dr. Krell stood with practiced care. "Mrs. Thorne, may I present Talion Laharix, formerly of the Galactic Mapping Consortium. Talion, this is Ilaria Thorne, our most distinguished resident." Mrs. Thorne extended a hand, 5 slender digits with swollen joints and prominent veins beneath nearly transparent skin. "Welcome to Stellar Twilight, young man. I'm Ilaria Thorne. I believe our friends have been telling you about me." Talion stared at the offered hand for a moment before remembering the Solari greeting custom. He extended his top right arm, allowing his 3-fingered hand to be enveloped by her 5. Her grip was surprisingly firm despite the visible tremor. Yes, he managed, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "They mentioned you've been here since the beginning. Since before the beginning, in a manner of speaking." She confirmed with a smile that created a constellation of creases around her bright blue eyes. "I watched them construct this place. My late husband was one of the consulting engineers specialized in multi-species environmental systems. When they opened the facility, it seemed fitting that I should be their first resident. Talyen's head fronds twitched in agitation. Forgive my directness, but are you truly 103 years old, without any form of artificial life extension? Mrs. Thorne's laugh was unexpectedly melodious. 103 years, 2 months, and 16 days, if we are being precise. And no extensions or neural augmentations for me. I've always preferred to keep my natural mind. But how? Talyen couldn't help asking, his scientific curiosity overwhelming his social restraint. Solari biology is demonstrably vulnerable. Your species lacks redundant organs, possesses minimal regenerative capacity, and your cellular structure is notoriously susceptible to degradation. Rather than taking offense, Mrs. Thorne seemed amused by his assessment. You've done your xenobiological homework, I see. All technically accurate, yet somehow we persist. She tapped her temple with a gnarled finger. Perhaps we're simply too stubborn to follow the expected timeline. Dr. Krell cleared his throat politely. Mrs. Thorne holds the distinction of outliving every resident who has come and gone since Stella Twilight's founding. Even species typically considered long-lived by galactic standards. You must understand my skepticism, Talyen persisted, though his tone has softened. I'm considered ancient among my kind at 42 cycles. The notion that a Solari could live more than twice that span contradicts established biological models. Models are useful but rarely complete, Mrs. Thorne observed, accepting a cup of tea from Madame Glierna with a grateful nod. Besides, I'm hardly exceptional by Solari standards. My grandmother lived to 108, and ever since cancer was cured, 120 hasn't been uncommon. Talyen's central eye widened to its maximum aperture. 120 cycles. Trillium supplied helpfully, his compound eyes reflecting the overhead illumination, quite remarkable when framed in that context. The conversation paused as Director Nix will approach their table, data tablet in hand. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said, her silver blue skin catching the ambient light. I wanted to confirm the details for tomorrow's garden tour, Mrs. Thorne. Ah, yes, the new botanical selection, Mrs. Thorne replied. I've been looking forward to seeing how the terrestrial specimens are adapting to the artificial environment. Director Nix nodded, making a notation on her tablet. Your expertise has been invaluable to the project. Few of our staff understand Solara botany as intimately as you do. Well, I've had 90 years to study it, Mrs. Thorne said with a modest smile. She turned to Talyen. You should join us for the tour if you're interested. The garden includes several remarkable adaptive species. Before Talyen could respond, Director Nix noticed him and brightened. Mr. Nahrix, I trust you're settling in well. I see you've met Mrs. Thorne. Indeed, Talyen replied, still trying to process the reality of the Solari woman's existence. We were just discussing her historical perspective on the facility. No one knows Stellar Twilight better. Director Nix will agree. Mrs. Thorne remembered me when I was just a child, visiting my father's workplace. I believe I was rather unimpressed with the whole operation at that age. Mrs. Thorne chuckled. You were a teenager, with far more interesting things on your mind than a retirement facility. Though you certainly seem to absorb the operational details, despite your apparent disinterest, you run this place more efficiently than your father ever did. Director Nixwill's expression softened at the mention of her father. High price, considering he designed most of our protocols. Mrs. Thorne knew poor as Nixwill better than most. She was on the resident advisory board during the entire planning phase. Talyen looked between the two, mental calculations raising. You were a teenager when Mrs. Thorne arrived here. I was 15. Director Nix will confirmed. My father served as the founding administrator for 22 years before his retirement. I've held the position for 16 years since. I've watched this young woman grow up, Mrs. Thorne added, her blue eyes twinkling. From a sullen adolescent to a competent administrator, one of the privileges of longevity is witnessing such transformations. The solstice gathering was Ilaria's idea, Madame Glierna added, as was the memorial garden for deported residents. Dr. Krell nodded in agreement. Her knowledge of crow species' medical needs has proven invaluable to our healthcare protocols as well. She served on the Medical Advisory Committee for 20 years. Mrs. Thorne waved away their praise with a slightly trembling hand. Merely the advantages of being around a long time. When one lives long enough, patterns become apparent that might otherwise remain obscure. A complex emotion crossed Talyen's face, something between awe and distress. His head fronds drooped visibly. In 42 cycles, I have seen 7 generations of my own family line across several worlds and stations. Yet you've witnessed entire lifespans of other species within a single facility. Different perspectives of the same cosmos, Mrs. Thorne said gently, neither more valid than the other. After Director Nixwell departed, Mrs. Thorne described in vivid detail the ceremony she had witnessed 38 years prior, the architectural unveiling, the diplomatic speeches, the installation of the central garden that served as the community's heart, and which was now being expanded. Her account included precise observations about individuals long since departed. The first medical doctor whose scales had been an unusual shade of copper. The Vesperian chef who introduced cross-cultural cuisine to the dining program. The Arcturian botanist who designed the original life support system. As she spoke, Talyen watched her with growing fascination. Her recall appeared flawless, her narrative coherent and nuanced. There was no evidence of the cognitive deterioration he would have expected in a creature of such advanced years. "You remember the current director as a child," Talyen said, more of a statement of dawning comprehension than a question. "You've literally watched her grow from adolescence to middle age." Mrs. Thorne nodded. "One of many I've had the privilege to observe. Your species experiences such transitions differently, I imagine. We rarely witness more than a fraction of another's life cycle," Talyen admitted. "My own progenitors had already entered final decline when I was barely establishing my first career position. By the time I achieved senior classification, they had been gone for over a decade. As the group eventually relocated to the observatory lounge for evening refreshments, Talyen found himself seated beside Mrs. Thorne. The gas giant filled the transparent dome above them, its atmospheric bands creating a hypnotic display of amber and crimson currents. "May I ask you something rather personal?" Talyen inquired, his voice softer than it had been all day. "Of course," Mrs. Thorne replied, her gnarled fingers working on what appeared to be a new needlework project, a reproduction of the very gas giant swirling above them. "Does it not trouble you?" he asked. "Watching so many come and go while you remain. There must be a certain solitude in such extended existence." Mrs. Thorne's hands paused momentarily. "There is," she acknowledged. "Each farewell carries its own weight, but there's also a profound gratitude in being permitted to witness so many journeys, even if only for a portion of their duration." She resumed her stitching, adding a delicate crimson thread to represent one of the planet's storm systems. "Besides, memory preserves connections that physical presence cannot. In some sense, those I've known are still with me." Talyen watched her weathered hands move with practiced precision. Despite the visible tremor, each stitch found its place with remarkable accuracy. "I've spent my entire adult life proud of my exceptional longevity," he confessed. "Among my species, 42 cycles represents an almost unprecedented lifespan. I've outlived all my contemporaries, and it is an achievement worthy of recognition." Mrs. Thorne assured him, "Each species faces different challenges along their temporal journey." "Yet here you sit," Talion continued, his head fronds drooping slightly. "Having lived more than twice my span, not as some medical anomaly, but as a reasonable typical example of your kind." Mrs. Thorne set her needlework in her lap and turned to face him directly. "Mr. Naharix, longevity itself confers no inherent virtue. It is merely one parameter of existence, neither more nor less significant than the other: the fight. The incapacity for accelerated learning and neural adaptation is every bit as remarkable as Solari endurance. You could shock many of my kind with how young you started your career. Entering the workforce at age 3 is as unfathomable to me as my own current age is to you. I've studied 17 star systems," he said quietly, "cataloged thousands of celestial phenomena, witnessed the birth of stellar formations and the death of ancient suns. Yet somehow, Mrs. Thorne, you represent the most unexpected discovery of my career." She smiled at that, the expression creating a familiar constellation of creases around her bright blue eyes. "The universe rarely conforms to expectation, Mr. Naharix. That's what makes it worth exploring. Wouldn't you agree?" When he finally retired to his quarters that night, Talion accessed the facility's information network and requested every available resource on Solari biology, development, and lifespan. His scientific mind, honed through just shy of 4 decades of meticulous stellar cartography, had found a new phenomenon to chart, one far more complex and fascinating than any celestial body he had ever documented. Morning light streamed through the observatory dome, casting prismatic patterns across the community lounge. Talion sat alone by the expansive viewport, watching the gas giant's atmospheric currents churn below. The swirling storms that had initially captivated him now seemed an apt metaphor for his own turbulent thoughts. A week had passed since his introduction to Mrs. Thorne, and his understanding of his place in the cosmic timeline had fundamentally shifted. Every xenobiology text he'd studied in his youth had categorized Solaris as mid-range in longevity, their lifespans neither remarkably brief nor notably extended. Yet the evidence before him suggested otherwise. "Enjoying the view?" Mrs. Thorne's voice interrupted his contemplation. Her wheelchair gilded smoothly toward him, the anti-gravity mechanism emitting only the faintest hum. "It's certainly compelling," Talion replied, his head fronds lifting slightly in greeting, "though I find myself more intrigued by temporal perspectives than celestial ones today." Mrs. Thorne smiled, the expression familiar after their numerous conversations over the past week. "Temporal perspectives can be just as vast and disorienting as spatial ones, I've found." She positioned her wheelchair beside him, withdrawing what appeared to be a leather-bound volume from a small compartment. "I thought you might find this interesting." Talion accepted the object carefully in his upper hands. "What is it?" He examined the unfamiliar material, noting its weight and the subtle aroma of age emanating from its surface. "We call it a photo album," Mrs. Thorne explained. "Physical photographs, images captured on specialized paper rather than digital recordings. Something of an antique, practiced even among Solaris." Talion opened the album with careful movements, his central eye widening at the images preserved within. Miss Thorne appeared on the first page, notably younger, though still elderly by Solari standards. She stood, actually stood, without assistance beside a tall, blue-skinned Arcturian male who bore a striking resemblance to director Nixwell. Horace Nixwell, Mrs. Thorne confirmed, noting his interest. The founding director. This was taken at the opening ceremony. Talion turned the page, finding image after image of Mrs. Thorne, with various residents, some species he recognized, others entirely unfamiliar to his experience. In each photograph, the Solari woman aged almost imperceptibly, while those around her changed dramatically or disappeared entirely, replaced by new faces in subsequent images. How many of these individuals remain at stellar twilight? Talion asked, his voice subdued. None. Mrs. Thorne replied simply, "You're looking at nearly 4 decades of community members. Most completed their cycles during their residence here." She pointed to one image, herself seated beside a Vesperian, whose vibrant exoskeleton suggested youth compared to Trillium's faded coloration. This was Trillium's mentor, Navigator Pollux. He taught Trillium everything he knew about interstellar cartography before his passing 20 years ago. Another page revealed Mrs. Thorne with a translucent, gelatinous being that resembled Madame Glirna. Matriarch Oslidi, she explained, Glirna's parent cluster representative. She lived here for 14 years before molecular dissipation claimed her. Page after page, documented faces and forms long departed, each accompanied by Mrs. Thorne's clear recollection of names, relationships, and distinctive traits. Her memory seemed unfailingly precise, even for events decades past. "Here," she said, tapping one particular photograph. "This might especially interest you." The image showed a young girl, Larian Nixwell, a teenager with gangly limbs and a self-conscious posture, standing awkwardly beside Mrs. Thorne during what appeared to be a community celebration. "Director Nixwell is an adolescent," Talion marveled. "You truly have witnessed her entire development into adulthood." "Indeed," Mrs. Thorne confirmed. "She used to visit her father during school holidays, absolutely despised it at first, found the facility desperately boring, and the residents impossibly ancient." She chuckled softly. Teenagers rarely appreciate the value of accumulated experience. They continued through the album, reaching most recent images that included current residents. Trillium appeared in several photographs, his exoskeleton gradually fading from vibrant yellow to its current muted amber. Krell's once prominent crest diminished with each successive image. Madame Glirna's translucent form showed subtle signs of hardening over the years. "What is the secret?" Talion finally asked, closing the album with careful reverence. "How do Solaris persist for so long? I've reviewed the biological data, but none of it explains your extraordinary endurance." Mrs. Thorne considered the question, her blue eyes momentarily distant. "No grand secret, I'm afraid. Certainly nothing like advanced genetic engineering or revolutionary medical interventions, which is what most species initially assume." She adjusted her shawl, revealing the wedding ring that had adorned her finger for decades. "Solari biology is actually quite remarkable by galactic standards. As you said that first day we met, Solaris lacked natural armor, possess minimal regenerative capabilities, and our cellular structure is indeed vulnerable to various forms of damage. Yet you endure," Talion prompted, his head fronds rising with curiosity. "We do," she agreed, "perhaps because we evolved on a world that demanded persistence above all else. Solara isn't peaceful or consistent like many home worlds. It's dynamic, often hostile. Solara quakes, floods, droughts, volcanic eruptions, pandemic diseases. We adapted, not by becoming impervious to harm, but by simply enduring it." She gestured towards the gas giant below. "Think of it like those storm systems. They persist, not because they're invulnerable to disruption, but because they constantly reform despite it. Solaris aren't exceptionally durable in structure. We're exceptionally persistent in process. We may trip or fall or get hurt, but we'll always get right back up to take the next step. Talyan nodded slowly, his scientific mind engaging with a concept. A fascinating adaptive strategy. We simply experience time differently than most sentient species, Mrs. Thorne added, neither faster nor slower. Just differently. Later that morning, Talyan joined a small group of residents gathering in the community garden for a horticulture session led by Mrs. Thorne. Despite her reliance on the anti-gravity wheelchair, she moved through the garden with evident expertise, identifying various plant species and explaining their care requirements. From a respectful distance, Talyan observed as Mrs. Thorne patiently demonstrated propagation techniques to Madame Glirna and several other residents. Her gnarled hands worked with such efficiency that made up for their lax gait, gently separating root systems and transplanting delicate seedlings with remarkable dexterity, despite the visible tremor. Terrestrial flora can be quite resilient in adaptive environments, she explained, her voice carrying clearly across the garden chamber. These specimens have adjusted remarkably well to our artificial growing conditions. Dr. Krell approached Talyan, his olive-tone scales catching the light from the agricultural lamps overhead. She's been tending to this garden since the facility opened, he noted. Most of these plant lineages descend from her original specimens, descendants of her initial cultivation, Talyan mused, much like the generations of residents she's witnessed. Come and go, Krell nodded, the modest ridge along his skull rising slightly. Do you remember what I said a week ago? She is an institution. Hilaria represents something of a living archive for stellar twilight. Her memory preserves histories that would otherwise be lost to time. It's remarkable, Talyan admitted. Among my kind, such continuity of knowledge is impossible. Our accelerated lifespans necessitate frequent transfers of information, with inevitable degradation each transition. Krell studied him with practiced medical assessment. You've trusted your perspective considerably since your arrival, Mr. Naharix. Evidence demanded reconsideration. Talyan replied simply. The universe rarely accommodates our preconceptions. Besides, my species is known for our speed in change. Dr. Krell made a sound that Talyan had come to recognize as a thoughtful agreement. Solaris evolved in a world caught in an endless cycle of creation and destruction, the physician explained. Their planet's surface constantly reshapes itself through tectonic movement. Their atmosphere transforms through dynamic weather systems. Even their biosphere persists through continuous cycles of growth and decay. He gestured towards Mrs. Thorne, who is now showing a young Arcturian staff member how to identify healthy root structures. The revolutionary strategy wasn't to resist these forces, but to adapt to them, to persist despite them. When removed from their homeworld's constant assault, their inherent durability manifests as extraordinary longevity. Talyan's central eye widened with comprehension. They evolved to withstand their world's hostility and now benefit from its absence. Precisely, Dr. Krell confirmed. What seems miraculous to us was merely necessary for them. As evening approached, Talyan found himself attending a community gathering in the central lounge. Residents, staff, and visitors from 12 different species has assembled for what appeared to be an informal storytelling session, with Mrs. Thorne naturally at its center. The elderly Solari sat in her wheelchair, a handcraft quilled across her lap, depicting a star map of the local galactic sector. Around her, residents had arranged themselves in a loose circle, many with beverages appropriate to their species' biology. "Tell us about the first interstellar embassy on Solara," requested a young Vesperian aide, his vibrant exoskeleton suggesting he had only recently reached maturity. Mrs. Thorne smiled, setting aside her needlework. "The Malaysian Accord," she began, her voice clear despite her age. "I was only a girl then, but I remember the global broadcasts when the Arcturian delegation first submerged from their vessel." For nearly an hour, she recounted historical events she had personally witnessed, diplomatic milestones, technological advancements, cultural exchanges that had shaped Solariety's integration into galactic society. Her narrative wove together political developments with personal observations, creating a textured account that no historical document could match. Talion noticed how residents of various species deferred to her recollections, occasionally seeking clarification or additional context about events that had occurred before their own birth. Even Director Nixwell, who had joined the gathering during a break from her administrative duties, listened with evident respect to Mrs. Thorne's account of early Solari-Arcturian relations. "My father often cited your perspective on those initial negotiations," Director Nixwell commented. "He claimed your insights helped shape the multi-species accommodation protocols that eventually led to facilities like Archive Haven." Mrs. Thorne nodded, her white hair catching the ambient light. Porras was remarkably receptive to cross-cultural input. He understood that comfortable retirement required more than mere physical accommodation. It needed cultural sensitivity as well. As the gathering continued, Talion found himself drawn into the communal atmosphere. The assembly represented a remarkable diversity of physiologies, life cycles, and cultural backgrounds. Yet Mrs. Thorne served as a common reference point for them all, a living bridge spanning decades of shared history. Later, as residents began dispersing to their evening activities, Talion approached Mrs. Thorne with a question that had lingered since their first encounter. "Throughout your century of experiences," he began, "what would you consider your most significant observation about sentient existence?" Mrs. Thorne considered the question with evident care, her blue eyes focused on some middle distance. "Perhaps the realization that time itself is meaningless," she finally answered. "What feels fleeting to one may seem eternal to another, yet beneath even that subjective viewpoint, we share a fundamental similarity. We all seek meaning, within whatever duration we're granted." She adjusted her shawl with slightly trembling hands. "Your 42 cycles contain experiences just as rich and significant as my 103 years, Mr. Naharix. Time is not the thing to measure them by." 2 years later, Talion stood in the memorial garden, his teal skin now faded to an even paler hue. Residents from throughout stellar twilight had gathered to commemorate the life of Ilaria Thorne, who had finally reached her journey's end at 105 years. Dr. Krell spoke first, his once olive scales now dulled to practically white. Ilaria Thorne witnessed the founding of this community and outlived every resident who joined during its first 3 decades. Her perspective enriched our collective understanding, and her wisdom guided countless decisions that shaped our environment. Madame Glierna followed, her gelatinous form showing increased crystallization around the edges. Ilaria's memory served as our community's archive. Through her collections, those long departed remained present in our consciousness. She preserved not merely facts, but essences, the distinctive qualities that made each resident unique. Trillium, his exoskeleton now faded almost completely to a pale amber, added his own tribute. "She understood the music of the spheres," he said. "His wing case is vibrating softly. The rhythms of existence that transcend individual species and unite all sentient experience." Director Nixwell spoke of Mrs. Thorne's influence on the facility's development, detailing how the Solari woman's suggestions had shaped everything, from architectural modifications to cross-species social protocols. She helped create a true community from what might otherwise have been merely a collection of elderly beings. The director concluded, when Talyen's turn came, he stepped forward with careful movements. His joints had begun to stiffen noticeably in recent months, a common symptom of advanced age among Fithians. "I arrived at stellar twilight, believing myself exceptional," he began, his voice wavering slightly. He paused, his singular eye surveying the assembled residents. "Then I met Mrs. Thorne, who had lived more than twice my span, and that was nothing special. In her presence I was forced to reconsider my understanding of time and morality." His head franz drooped slightly in an expression of respect. "She taught me that longevity itself confers no inherent virtue. It merely offers different perspectives of the same cosmos. The Fithian experience of accelerated existence is neither superior nor inferior to the Solari experience of extended duration. They are simply different windows through which conscious beings observe the universe." As Talyen returned to his place among the mourners, he felt a familiar tightness in his thoracic cavity, another sign that his own remaining time had grown increasingly finite. The medical scans confirmed what his body had been signaling for months. Despite his exceptional longevity by Fithian standards, his biological systems were approaching their terminal phase. In all likelihood, he would not witness another seasonal cycle at stellar twilight. The realization brought not despair, but a certain contemplative acceptance, a perspective he suspected Mrs. Thorne would have appreciated. Later, as residents dispersed following the memorial service, Talyen lingered in the garden. He studied the commemorative marker bearing Mrs. Thorne's name, dates, and a simple inscription, "Time's Witness, Memory's Keeper." Krell joined him, moving with a careful deliberation of advancing years. "She knew you, you know," the physician said quietly, "about your condition. Her experience with so many species gave her an intuitive understanding of life cycle progression." Talyen nodded, unsurprised. During our final conversation, she mentioned that temporal perception often shifts near life's conclusion, that moments gain a certain luminous quality as they become increasingly precious. "A common observation among those nearing the end," Dr. Krell acknowledged, "though everyone experiences it differently." They stood in companionable silence, surrounded by memorial markers commemorating residents long departed. Each stone represented a being who had once moved through these corridors, participated in communal gatherings, shared experiences across species boundaries, now preserved only in memory. "She outlived every resident who arrived before her," Talyen mused, "and now will outlive me as well, at least in memory. There's something fitting in that continuity." Dr. Krell made a sound of gentle agreement. As the distant sun began its descent towards the gas giant's horizon, casting the guard in an amber twilight, Talyen considered how dramatically his perspective has shifted since his arrival. The pride that had once defined his self-concept, his exceptional longevity among Phaethians, had transformed him into something more nuanced, an appreciation for how much he achieved with what little time he had. In the dance of cosmic existence, the Phaethian life cycle represented one rhythm among many, accelerated and brief by some standards, yet containing the essential elements of sentient experience. Mrs. Thorne's century-spanning Solari journey offered a different temporal pattern, extended yet equally finite, against the backdrop of universal time. "Different windows," Talion murmured, echoing his earlier observation. "Neither better nor worse, simply different angles from which to observe the same magnificent cosmos." As twilight deepened into evening, he remained in the garden, watching the first stars emerge through the dome overhead. Among them shone the distant sun that had witnessed his birth 44 cycles ago, a stellar body he had once catalogued during his cartography career, now observing the final phase of his existence. The cosmic symmetry felt appropriate somehow. His life had begun, and would conclude under the same distant light. A momentary convergence in the vast, intricate choreography of the cosmos, as Talion watched the stars rise over Archive Haven. Memory and mortality danced quietly within him. He had catalogued the heavens. She had lived beneath them, one measured time by light years, the other by generations. But in the end, they both found purpose not in how long they existed, but in how deeply they connected.